The encounter on the road. Jake Peterson's life was defined by small routines and big worries. At just 17, he was already familiar with burdens no teenager should bear. Every day felt like an uphill battle as he juggled school, helping his mom run the diner, and the constant gnaw of overdue bills threatening to upend their fragile lives. His second-hand clothes, worn-out shoes, and rusted bike were constant reminders of the stark difference between him and the privileged kids in his school. But Jake had a determination forged from necessity, and that made him different. He worked tirelessly, never complaining, never stopping. One crisp evening after his shift at the diner, Jake pedaled his bike along the dimly lit streets of their small, aging town. The air was tinged with the scent of fall leaves, and his breath came out in small puffs in the cold air. The rhythmic clatter of his bike chain was almost hypnotic as he headed home. It was a quiet evening, almost eerily so, until he spotted something unusual on the side of the road. A car, clearly an older model, was parked awkwardly on the shoulder. Its hood was open, and smoke curled into the air like a faint distress signal. Next to it, an older man paced with a phone pressed to his ear, his face a mix of frustration and worry. The man's suit, sharp and expensive-looking, seemed completely out of place against the backdrop of cracked asphalt and looming pine trees. Jake slowed his bike, hesitating. He could keep riding. It wasn't his problem. But something tugged at him. The man looked out of his depth, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he ought to help. "Need a hand?" Jake called out, braking to a stop a few feet away. The man looked up, startled. His phone dangled loosely in his hand. "It's the engine," he said with a sigh. "I've been trying to call a tow truck, but no one's answering." Jake parked his bike against a tree and approached cautiously. "Mind if I take a look? I'm not a mechanic, but I've messed around with engines a bit." The man raised an eyebrow, but stepped aside. "Be my guest." Jake leaned over the hood, wincing at the heat radiating from the engine. He surveyed the scene with an experienced eye. Thanks to afternoons spent helping his uncle with his old truck, the problem wasn't immediately obvious, but Jake noticed a small pool of coolant beneath the car and traced it to a crack in the radiator hose. "It's your radiator," Jake said after a moment. "There's a leak." The man sighed heavily. "Wonderful. Just what I needed. Can you fix it?" Jake hesitated. "Not permanently, but I can patch it up enough to get you to a mechanic. Got any duct tape?" The man blinked at him, incredulous. "Duct tape? Seriously?" Jake shrugged. "It's not ideal, but it works in a pinch." The man stared at him for a moment, then rummaged in his trunk and produced a roll of tape. Jake carefully wrapped the damaged hose, working quickly but meticulously. When he was satisfied, he stepped back and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Try it now," he said. The man climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. Jake grinned. "That should hold for a few miles. Just don't push it." The man stepped out of the car, shaking his head in disbelief. "You just saved me a tow," he said. "I can't thank you enough." "No problem," Jake said, brushing his hands on his jeans. "Glad I could help." "Let me pay you for your trouble," the man said, reaching into his wallet. Jake shook his head. "You don't need to do that." The man frowned. "Are you sure? Most people wouldn't stop to help, let alone turn down money." Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's no big deal." The man looked at him for a long moment, his sharp eyes scanning Jake's worn clothes, his duct-taped shoes, the rusted bike propped against the tree. "What's your name, kid?" he asked finally. "Jake." "Well, Jake, you've got a good heart," the man said, extending a hand. "Tom Harrison." Jake shook it, his smaller, calloused hand gripping the man's firm, polished one. "Nice to meet you." "Nice to meet you too," Tom said. "I don't think I'll forget it." Jake didn't think much of the encounter as he pedaled home, the patched-up car disappearing into the distance. For him, It was just another small good deed in a life full of challenges. He had no way of knowing that his act of kindness had set something far greater into motion. A surprising visit. The next morning started like any other for Jake. The thin November sunlight filtered through the worn blinds in his small bedroom, casting faint patterns on the peeling wallpaper. He swung his legs out of bed, feeling the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. His mom, Sarah, was already in the kitchen when he walked in, a mug of instant coffee steaming in her hands and a stack of unopened bills sitting on the counter. "You're up early," she said, glancing at him. Jake shrugged. "Got homework." The truth was, he couldn't sleep. The weight of the eviction notice taped to their fridge was like a constant knot in his stomach. He'd hidden it yesterday, crumpled and shoved deep into his pocket, but his mom had found it anyway. Now it sat in the middle of the table like a silent accusation, the bright red text screaming at them both. Sarah sighed, pushing the stack of bills aside. "Eat something before you go to school." "I'm not hungry," Jake said, grabbing his backpack and heading for the door. He knew if he stayed, the conversation would inevitably turn to money, or the lack of it. School was its usual blur of monotony, punctuated by the occasional jab from kids who seemed to take pleasure in pointing out Jake's frayed clothes and duct-taped sneakers. He ignored them, as he always did, focusing instead on getting through the day. By the time the final bell rang, he was more than ready to leave. As Jake pedaled to the diner where he worked after school, the encounter with the man from last night was a faint memory. The diner was his second home, a cramped, greasy little place that smelled of burnt coffee and fried food. His mom had managed it for years, working long hours to keep them afloat. Jake had started helping out when he was 13, bussing tables and washing dishes after school. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a job. When he pushed open the door, the familiar bell jingled overhead. Sarah was behind the counter, flipping through receipts with a furrowed brow. She looked up and gave him a tired smile. "You're late." "Sorry, Mom," Jake mumbled, dropping his backpack near the staff closet and grabbing a dishcloth. He started wiping down tables without being asked, falling into the rhythm of work. The diner was slow that afternoon. A few regulars sat at the counter nursing cups of coffee, and a young couple shared a basket of fries in the corner booth. Jake had just finished refilling the sugar dispensers when the bell above the door jingled again. He turned, expecting another regular, but froze when he saw who had walked in. It was Tom Harrison, the man from the night before. He was wearing another sharp suit, his white hair neatly combed, and he looked completely out of place in the worn-down diner. His polished shoes clacked against the linoleum floor as he approached the counter. "Coffee. Black," he said, smiling faintly at Sarah. Sarah, for her part, looked suspicious. Her eyes darted to Jake, then back to Tom. "We don't see many suits around here," she said as she poured his coffee. Tom chuckled, taking a seat at the counter. "I was in the neighborhood." Jake hovered near the back, unsure of what to do. Tom glanced over at him and smiled. "Jake," he said, nodding in greeting. "Good to see you again." Jake stepped forward, still uncertain. "Hey, Mr. Harrison." "Tom," the older man corrected. "Mr. Harrison makes me sound older than I already am." Jake gave a small, awkward laugh. "What are you doing here?" Tom took a sip of his coffee before answering. "I came to see you." "Me?" Jake asked, confused. "Why?" "Because of what you did last night," Tom said, setting his cup down. "Not many people would stop to help a stranger, let alone turn down money for it. That kind of character is rare, Jake." Jake felt his face flush. "It wasn't a big deal," he mumbled. "To you, maybe," Tom said, "but it was to me." At that moment, Sarah stepped in, her arms crossed. "What do you want with my son?" she asked, her tone sharp. Tom turned to her, his expression calm. "I don't want anything from him. I want to offer him an opportunity." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "What kind of opportunity?" Tom leaned back in his chair, looking between them. I own a luxury car dealership in town. We're always looking for hardworking, dependable people. Last night, I saw that in Jake. He's got potential, and I'd like to help him develop it." Sarah frowned. "And what's in it for you?" "Nothing," Tom said simply. "Someone helped me once when I was in Jake's shoes. This is my way of paying it forward." Jake glanced at his mom, who still looked skeptical. "It's just a part-time job," Tom continued. "Cleaning cars, running errands, nothing too complicated. But if he's interested, I'd also be willing to help him get into a technical school to learn the trade. With the right training, Jake could make a real career out of this." For a moment, there was silence. Jake could feel his mom's hesitation, her protectiveness. She didn't trust easily, and for good reason. Life had taught them both that promises often came with strings attached. "I don't know," Sarah said finally. "We've heard promises like this before." "I understand," Tom said. "You don't have to decide now. Just think about it." He stood, placing a few bills on the counter for the coffee. "Jake, if you're interested, come by the dealership after school tomorrow." "No pressure." Jake nodded, still processing what had just happened. "Okay." As Tom walked out, the sound of his car engine fading into the distance, Sarah turned to Jake. "You're not seriously thinking about this, are you?" Jake hesitated. "Mom, we need the money. And if he's telling the truth..." Sarah shook her head. "People like him don't help people like us without expecting something in return." "But what if he's different?" Jake countered. "What if this is my chance to do something more?" Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. "We'll talk about it later. Right now, we've got customers." Jake nodded, but the conversation stayed with him for the rest of the day. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that Tom's offer was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. It was a risk, but maybe, just maybe, it was worth taking. A leap of faith. The next day, Jake spent the morning trying to act normal. He kept his head down during classes, scribbling notes he barely paid attention to and avoiding the usual teasing from classmates about his worn clothes. But underneath the surface, his mind was racing. The idea of working at a luxury car dealership seemed almost surreal. He couldn't help but imagine himself walking among gleaming cars, learning about their engines, maybe even driving one someday. By the time school let out, he'd made up his mind. He was going to the dealership. Jake pedaled his bike across town, the crisp November air nipping at his face. He tried to push down the nerves that bubbled up as he approached the dealership. From a distance, it looked like a palace of polished steel and glass, completely out of place in their small, worn-down town. Rows of luxury cars gleamed under the afternoon sun, each one looking like it cost more than he and his mom made in a year. He parked his bike near the edge of the lot, hesitating as he stared at the building. What if this was a mistake? What if Tom Harrison was just like all the others who'd made promises they couldn't keep? But then he thought about the eviction notice on the fridge, his mom's exhausted face, and the weight of their bills. He had to take the chance. Pushing open the heavy glass door, Jake stepped into the dealership. The smell of leather and new cars hit him immediately, and the sleek, modern design of the showroom made him feel even more out of place. Salespeople in sharp suits moved between customers, their voices low and professional. Jake felt every inch, the scruffy, duct-taped shoes kid from the wrong side of town. "Jake." Tom Harrison's voice cut through his thoughts. The older man approached him with a broad smile, his hand extended. He looked just as polished as the dealership itself, but his smile was warm, and there was a genuine light in his eyes. "Glad you came," Tom said, shaking Jake's hand firmly. "Let me show you around." Jake nodded, trying to muster a confident smile. "Thanks, Mr. Harrison." "Tom," he corrected again with a chuckle. "You're not working for me yet, but if you do, it's just Tom." Tom led Jake through the showroom, explaining the basics of the dealership. He pointed out the different sections, the sales floor, the service area, and the back lot where cars were cleaned and prepped. Jake listened intently, taking in every detail. though he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was staring at him. A few employees threw him curious glances, but most didn't seem to notice him at all. When they reached the service area, Tom stopped and turned to Jake. "This is where you'll start if you decide to take the job. It's not glamorous, but it's important. Cleaning cars, organizing tools, running errands. It keeps everything running smoothly." Jake nodded, glancing around the service area. It was a little less intimidating than the showroom, and he felt a flicker of hope. This was something he could do. "Think you can handle it?" Tom asked. "Yeah," Jake said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I can handle it." "Good," Tom said, clapping him on the shoulder. "We'll start you part-time. After school and weekends, if that works for you. And if you stick with it, there's room to grow." "Grow," Jake echoed. Tom nodded. "This is just the beginning. If you're interested, I'll help you get into a technical school. You've got a knack for fixing things, Jake. With the right training, you could turn that into a career. But it's up to you. I'm not going to hand you anything. You'll have to work for it." Jake swallowed hard, the weight of the offer sinking in. "I'm willing to work," he said quietly. "I know you are," Tom said, smiling. "That's why I'm giving you this chance." That evening, Jake rode home with a strange mix of excitement and anxiety buzzing in his chest. He had a job now. A real job. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He just hoped his mom would see it that way. When he walked into their cramped apartment, Sarah was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup. She looked up when he entered, her expression a mix of curiosity and worry. "Well?" she asked, setting the spoon down. Jake hesitated, leaning his bike against the wall. "I got the job." Sarah's brow furrowed. "And what exactly are you going to be doing?" "Cleaning cars, running errands," Jake said quickly. "It's nothing fancy, but it's a start. And he said if I stick with it, he'll help me get into a technical school. I could learn how to fix cars for real, Mom. This could be my chance." Sarah crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. "And you believe him?" Jake nodded. "I do. He's not like the others, Mom. He's different." Sarah sighed, her shoulders sagging. "I just don't want you to get hurt, Jake. We've been let down too many times." "I know," Jake said softly, "but we don't have a choice. We need the money, and this could lead to something better. I have to try." After a long pause, Sarah nodded. "Okay, but if anything feels off, anything, you walk away. Promise me." "I promise," Jake said. Jake's first day on the job was harder than he expected. The work itself wasn't complicated, washing cars, organizing tools, sweeping the garage floor, but it was constant, and the other employees didn't make it any easier. Mark, a tall guy in a dealership polo shirt, seemed to take particular pleasure in needling him. "Hey, new kid," Mark said as Jake scrubbed the wheels of a black sedan. "You missed a spot." Jake gritted his teeth but kept scrubbing. He wasn't about to let Mark get under his skin. Mark chuckled, leaning against the car. "What are you even doing here? You don't exactly scream dealership material." "I'm here to work," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. Mark smirked. "Well, good luck with that." By the end of the day, Jake's arms were sore and his back ached from bending over the cars. But when Tom handed him his first paycheck, the pain faded into the background. It wasn't much, but it was more money than he'd ever made in a single week. For the first time, he felt like he'd taken a step forward. When he got home that night, he handed the envelope to his mom. She opened it, her eyes widening slightly at the amount. "It's a start," Jake said, his voice cautious. Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "It is," she said quietly. "It really is." For the first time in a long time, Jake felt something he hadn't dared to feel before. Hope. The grind and the glimmer of hope. The next few weeks at the dealership tested Jake in ways he hadn't expected. The work wasn't just physically demanding. It was emotionally draining, too. Every morning, he would piddle his old rusted bike across town, arriving early to avoid the stares of the polished sales team and seasoned mechanics. The dealership floor gleamed with wealth and possibility, but Jake always felt like an outsider looking in. His responsibilities were clear: clean the cars, keep the service area organized, and fetch whatever tools or supplies the mechanics needed. It wasn't glamorous, but Jake threw himself into it with determination. He scrubbed, polished, and wiped down every car as if it was his own, refusing to let his growing calluses or aching muscles slow him down. The biggest challenge, though, wasn't the work, it was Mark. The tall, arrogant mechanic seemed to have made it his mission to needle Jake at every opportunity. Whether it was snide comments about Jake's duct-taped sneakers or sarcastic jabs about his cleaning skills, Mark never missed a chance to remind Jake of his place. "Careful with that rag, kid," Mark said one afternoon, leaning against a gleaming sports car Jake had just finished cleaning. "You wouldn't want to leave a scratch. Not that you'd know the difference." Jake clenched his jaw, willing himself not to react. He knew better than to give Mark the satisfaction. Instead, he focused on his work, silently reminding himself why he was here. One day, while Jake was scrubbing the wheels of a luxury SUV, Tom Harrison walked over and crouched beside him. "How's it going, Jake?" he asked, his tone casual but warm. Jake glanced up, surprised. "Ugh, good. Just trying to keep up." Tom smiled, nodding toward the spotless SUV. "You're doing more than keeping up. I've had a few customers comment on how their cars look better after you've cleaned them. That's saying something." Jake felt a flicker of pride, though he quickly suppressed it. "Thanks," he mumbled, returning to his work. Tom straightened, watching Jake for a moment before speaking again. "You've got a good work ethic, Jake. But don't let people like Mark get to you." Jake froze, his hands tightening on the sponge. "You noticed that?" Tom chuckled. "I've been in this business a long time. There's always someone like Mark, someone who thinks tearing others down makes them stronger. Don't buy into it." Jake nodded, grateful but unsure how to respond. He had never had anyone in a position of authority stand up for him before, and it felt strange. "By the way," Tom added, "I got something I want to show you. Finish up here and meet me in the back lot." Jake finished the SUV as quickly as he could, curiosity buzzing in his chest. When he walked into the back lot, he found Tom standing beside an old, beat-up car. The paint was faded, the tires were worn, and the engine looked like it hadn't been started in years. "What's this?" Jake asked, puzzled. Tom grinned. "This, my friend, is your new project." "My project," Jake repeated, his brow furrowing. Tom nodded. "If you're serious about learning how to fix cars, there's no better way than hands-on experience. This old girl needs a lot of work, and I figured you'd be the perfect person to bring her back to life." Jake stared at the car, his heart pounding. "You're giving this to me?" "Let's call it a loan," Tom said. "You'll work on it here after hours. Use the tools, ask the mechanics for advice, and figure it out piece by piece. When it's done, we'll see where you're at." For a moment, Jake couldn't speak. He ran his hand over the car's dented hood, feeling a mix of excitement and disbelief. "Why are you doing this for me?" he finally asked. Tom's expression softened. "Because someone did the same for me once, and because I see potential in you, Jake. You just need the chance to prove it, to yourself and everyone else." Jake threw himself into the project with everything he had. After his regular shift, he stayed late at the dealership, tinkering with the car. It was slow going at first. The engine was a mess, the transmission was barely functional, and half the parts looked like they belonged in a museum. But Jake didn't let that discourage him. He pored over repair manuals, watched online tutorials, and peppered the mechanics with questions whenever they had a spare moment. Even Mark, despite his constant jabs, couldn't resist offering the occasional begrudging piece of advice. "You're putting the gasket on backward," Mark said one evening, leaning against the workbench with a smirk. "Unless you're trying to make the car worse." Jake glared at him, but flipped the gasket around without a word. Slowly but surely, the car began to take shape. Jake replaced the spark plugs, patched the exhaust, and sanded down the rust spots. Each small victory felt like a monumental achievement, and for the first time in his life, Jake started to believe in his own potential. One Friday evening, as Jake was cleaning up his tools, Tom walked into the garage holding a folder. "Got a minute?" he asked. Jake nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's up?" Tom handed him the folder. "This is the application for Grantville Technical School. I've already spoken to the admissions office, and they're willing to waive the application fee. All you need to do is fill it out and submit it." Jake stared at the folder, his heart racing. "You really think I can get in?" "I know you can," Tom said firmly. "And once you're there, you'll have access to resources and training that will take you to the next level. But the first step is up to you." Jake hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He wanted this, more than he'd ever wanted anything, but doubt gnawed at him. What if he wasn't good enough? What if he failed? As if reading his thoughts, Tom placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've already proven you're capable, Jake. The only question is whether you're willing to bet on yourself." That night, Jake sat at the kitchen table, the folder in front of him. His mom watched him from across the room, her expression a mix of worry and pride. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. Jake nodded, his voice steady. "I have to try, Mom." For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like his life was moving forward. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something. And for the first time, the future didn't feel like an impossible dream. It felt like a promise. The turning point. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of hard work, determination, and small but meaningful victories. Jake's life began to shift in ways he hadn't imagined. Between school, his shifts at the dealership, and the hours he spent working on the old car, there was little time for anything else. But Jake didn't mind. Every greasy bolt he tightened and every new skill he learned brought him closer to the future he was starting to believe in. One chilly Saturday morning, Jake arrived at the dealership earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale glow over the frost-dappled cars in the lot. Inside, the garage was quiet, the hum of the overhead lights the only sound. He had plans for the day, big plans. He was finally ready to try starting the car for the first time. Jake had spent weeks fixing everything he could. He'd replaced the spark plugs, patched the radiator, and rewired half the electrical system. The engine, once a hopeless jumble of rusted parts, now looked almost new, or as new as Jake could make it with his limited tools and budget. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the key in the ignition, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The engine coughed once, twice, and then roared to life. Jake sat back, a grin spreading across his face. He couldn't believe it. It actually worked. The sound was rough, uneven, but it was alive. He'd brought it back from the dead. "Not bad," came a voice from behind him. Jake turned to see Mark leaning against the garage door, a rare look of approval on his face. "Looks like you might actually know what you're doing." "Thanks," Jake said, still beaming. He didn't care if Mark's compliment was backhanded. It felt like validation all the same. Mark stepped closer, inspecting the car with a critical eye. "You've still got a long way to go," he said, pointing to the fenders. "Bodywork's a mess, and the alignment's probably shot. But for a kid, not bad at all." Jake nodded, knowing Mark was right. There was still so much to do, but hearing the engine come to life was a victory he wouldn't let anyone diminish. That afternoon, Tom Harrison stopped by to check on Jake's progress. He watched as Jake explained everything he'd done to the car, nodding thoughtfully. "You've done well," Tom said, his voice filled with genuine pride. "Most people wouldn't have even bothered trying. You didn't just fix this car, Jake, you brought it back to life. Jake looked down, trying to hide the flush of pride creeping up his neck. I had a lot of help, he said quietly. Maybe, Tom said, but it was your hands that did the work. Don't sell yourself short. Jake smiled, his confidence growing. For the first time, he felt like he might actually belong in this world, a world of tools, engines, and possibilities. The following Monday, Jake submitted his application to Grantville Technical School. It felt like a monumental step, one that sent a ripple of excitement and anxiety through him. As he handed the envelope to the admissions officer, he couldn't help but wonder if he was dreaming. Could a kid like him, someone who'd spent his life barely scraping by, really make it in a place like this? When he told his mom that evening, her reaction surprised him. Instead of the skepticism he'd expected, there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Pride. I'm proud of you, Jake, she said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. No matter what happens, you've already done more than I ever thought possible. Jake nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He knew she was still scared, still uncertain, but her words meant everything to him. At the dealership, things started to shift. Jake's work didn't go unnoticed. Customers began asking for the kid who made their cars shine like new, and some of the mechanics started to warm up to him. Even Mark, who had been his biggest critic, started treating him with a begrudging respect. One afternoon, as Jake was organizing tools in the garage, Mark approached him, holding a greasy wrench. Hey, kid, he said, his tone uncharacteristically serious. You've been doing good work, better than I expected. Jake looked up, surprised. Thanks. Mark hesitated, then added, I was hard on you at first. Guess I figured you wouldn't last, but you proved me wrong. Jake didn't know what to say. Coming from Mark, it felt like the highest compliment. A few weeks later, Jake received a letter from Grantville Technical School. His hand shook as he tore it open, the envelope crisp and official looking. His mom watched from across the room, her face a mix of hope and anxiety. Dear Mr. Peterson, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted. Jake's eyes widened, and he couldn't stop the grin that spread across his face. I got in, he shouted, holding the letter up like a trophy. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling in her eyes. Jake, that's incredible, she whispered, pulling him into a tight hug. You did it. For the first time in years, Jake felt like he was standing on the edge of something extraordinary. The future he'd dreamed of, one where he wasn't defined by struggle and scarcity, felt within reach. As Jake prepared for his first day at Grantville, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he'd come. From fixing a stranger's car on the side of the road to earning a place at a technical school, his journey had been anything but easy. But every challenge, every late night, and every snide comment from Mark had shaped him into someone stronger. And as he stepped into the sleek halls of Grantville Technical School, Jake knew this was just the beginning. He wasn't just fixing cars anymore. He was building a future, one bolt at a time. Building a legacy. Jake's first day at Grantville Technical School was a whirlwind of emotions. The campus was massive, filled with state-of-the-art equipment, polished tools, and students who looked as if they'd been born with wrenches in their hands. Compared to them, Jake felt out of place. His old jeans and duct-taped sneakers seemed to scream that he didn't belong, but he pushed the thought aside. He'd made it here because of his hard work, and he wasn't about to let self-doubt stop him now. His instructors were seasoned professionals with years of experience in the automotive world. From the moment he stepped into the first workshop, Jake was hooked. Engines were disassembled and reassembled with precision. Diagnostics tools flashed on screens, and the scent of oil and rubber filled the air. It was nothing like his old routine at the dealership. It was bigger, more technical, and more demanding. But Jake thrived. The first major challenge came 2 weeks into the program, a team project where students had to restore a completely inoperable car. Jake's team was assigned an old pickup truck, rusted and neglected, the kind of vehicle most would consider junk. The assignment was daunting. and his teammates weren't exactly welcoming at first. "We've got a long way to go," said Tim, a tall, wiry guy who seemed skeptical of Jake's ability from the start. "You ever done anything like this before?" "A little," Jake replied, not wanting to sound arrogant. "I rebuilt an old sedan back at the dealership I worked at." Tim raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment. Jake could tell his teammates were sizing him up, and he resolved to let his work speak for itself. As the weeks went on, Jake became the unofficial leader of the project. His practical experience gave him an edge, and his relentless work ethic inspired the rest of the team. When the engine refused to start, Jake was the one who stayed late, poring over diagrams and troubleshooting until he found the issue. When the wiring was a tangled mess, Jake took it apart and rewired it from scratch. By the time the project was due, the pickup truck looked and ran like new. During the presentation, their instructor praised the team for their work, but Jake's leadership was singled out. "This kind of initiative and dedication is rare," the instructor said, looking directly at Jake. "Keep it up, and you'll go far." Jake felt a surge of pride, not just for himself but for his team. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just working toward a career, he was building a reputation. Back at the dealership, Jake's life had changed in subtle but significant ways. He still worked part-time to help his mom with bills, but he was no longer the quiet, unsure kid scrubbing cars. His progress at school and the success of his first major project gave him a newfound confidence. Even Mark had softened toward him. "Looks like the kid's turning into a real mechanic," Mark said one afternoon, watching as Jake expertly diagnosed an issue with a customer's car. "Guess I can't call you a rookie anymore." Jake grinned. "Thanks, Mark. That means a lot, coming from you." "Don't get cocky," Mark said, smirking, but there was genuine respect in his tone. One evening, after a long day of classes and work, Jake returned home to find his mom sitting at the kitchen table. She had a strange look on her face, half pride, half sadness. In front of her was a thick envelope. "What's that?" Jake asked, setting his backpack down. Sarah slid the envelope toward him. "It's from the landlord." Jake's stomach sank. "Are we getting evicted?" Sarah shook her head. "No. Actually, it's the opposite. I've been working extra shifts, and with your paychecks, I finally caught up on the rent. They're offering to renew the lease." Jake blinked, stunned. For so long, the threat of losing their home had hung over them like a storm cloud. Now, for the first time, the sun was breaking through. "That's amazing, Mom," Jake said, sitting down beside her. "You did it." "No, Jake," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "We did it. I don't know where we'd be without you." Jake felt his throat tighten. For so long, he'd been driven by the fear of failure, of not being enough. Hearing his mom's words, he realized how far they'd come, not just financially, but as a family. As the months rolled on, Jake's reputation at Grantville and the dealership continued to grow. He tackled every challenge with the same grit and determination that had brought him this far, earning the respect of his peers and instructors alike. One day, Tom Harrison called Jake into his office at the dealership. Jake sat nervously in the leather chair across from Tom's desk, wondering what this was about. "You've come a long way, Jake," Tom said, leaning back in his chair. "When I first met you, I saw potential. Now, I see a future." Jake tilted his head, confused. "What do you mean?" Tom smiled. "I'm expanding the dealership. We're opening a new service center on the other side of town, and I need someone to oversee the operation. Someone who understands the work, someone who can lead. I want that someone to be you." Jake's jaw dropped. "Me? But I'm still in school." "I don't." "You've already proven yourself," Tom interrupted. "This isn't about your age or experience. It's about your character. I'll work with your schedule, and you'll have a team to support you, but I believe you're ready." Jake sat back, trying to process the offer. Just a year ago, he'd been scrubbing tables at the diner, wondering if life would ever get better. Now, He was being offered a leadership position at a luxury car dealership. It felt like a dream, but it was real. "I don't know what to say," Jake finally said. "Say yes," Tom said, smiling. "And keep proving me right." Jake nodded, a grin spreading across his face. "Yes, absolutely, yes." As Jake rode his bike home that evening, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. It had started with a simple act of kindness, helping a stranger fix his car on the side of the road. That moment had set off a chain of events that changed his life forever. Now, as he pedaled through the familiar streets of his neighborhood, Jake felt a sense of purpose and pride he'd never known before. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was building a legacy. And for the first time, the future felt like a road he was ready to travel. The road to greatness. Jake's promotion to oversee the new service center was the beginning of an entirely new chapter in his life. The challenges came fast and hard, but they only fueled his determination. For the first time, he wasn't just responsible for himself. He had a team relying on him. The pressure was immense, but Jake knew he couldn't let anyone down, especially not Tom, who had taken such a leap of faith in him. The service center, located on the outskirts of town, was a far cry from the sleek dealership showroom. It was a large utilitarian space, still smelling of fresh paint and new rubber. Jake's first task was to organize the chaos that comes with launching a new operation. Tools had to be sorted, workstations assigned, and processes implemented. It was overwhelming, but Jake dove in headfirst, staying late every night and arriving early every morning. His team was a mix of seasoned mechanics and fresh hires, all of whom were skeptical of their young boss at first. Jake understood their doubts. After all, he was just 18, still attending Grantville Technical School, and had little experience leading a group. But he knew how to earn their respect, by working harder than anyone else. Jake didn't just give orders. He worked alongside his team, getting his hands dirty with every oil change and engine overhaul. He stayed late to help troubleshoot problems, learned from the senior mechanics, and made sure every car that left their shop was in perfect condition. Slowly but surely, the team began to warm up to him. One day, as Jake was elbow-deep in a transmission rebuild, one of the senior mechanics, Louis, walked over. Louis had been with Tom's dealership for nearly 2 decades and had a reputation for being tough but fair. "You know," Louis said, wiping his hands on a rag, "when I heard you were going to be running this place, I wasn't sure what to think." Jake glanced up, unsure how to respond. "I get that," he said simply. Louis nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "But you've proven me wrong. You've got grit, kid. And you don't just talk, you do. That's rare." Jake felt a swell of pride, but kept his response humble. "Thanks, Louis. That means a lot." Louis patted him on the back. "Keep it up. You're doing good work." As the months rolled on, the service center began to thrive. Word spread quickly about the quality of their work and the professionalism of Jake's team. Customers who once took their luxury cars to dealerships in bigger cities started coming to them instead, impressed by the attention to detail and the personal touch Jake insisted on. One of those customers was a local businessman named Mr. Carter. He owned a chain of high-end restaurants and had a fleet of luxury vehicles that required regular maintenance. After his first visit to the service center, he sought Jake out personally. "You're Jake Peterson, right?" Mr. Carter asked, extending a hand. "Yes, sir," Jake said, shaking his hand. "I just wanted to say how impressed I am with your operation," Mr. Carter said. "Your team did a fantastic job on my car, and I've heard nothing but good things about this place." "Thank you," Jake said, his confidence growing. "We take pride in what we do." Mr. Carter nodded. "It shows. And I'd like to offer you a contract to handle the maintenance for all my vehicles." Jake's eyes widened. "All of them?" Mr. Carter smiled. "All of them. I like doing business with people who care about their work. I'll have my assistants send over the details." Jake could hardly believe it. This wasn't just a big deal. It was a game changer for the service center. He immediately called Tom to share the news. "You've exceeded my expectations, Jake," Tom said over the phone. "This is just the beginning." Meanwhile, at Grantville Technical School, Jake's studies continued to challenge him. His instructors noticed his growing confidence and leadership skills, often calling on him to mentor other students. Jake was more than happy to help, sharing everything he'd learned through both school and hands-on experience at the dealership. One day, his instructor, Mr. Bennett, pulled him aside after class. "Jake, have you ever thought about competing in the state auto tech championships?" Jake blinked. "The what?" Mr. Bennett chuckled. "It's a statewide competition for automotive students. You'd be representing Grantville. It's tough, but I think you'd do well." Jake hesitated. The idea of competing against the best students in the state was daunting, but the thought of pushing himself even further was exciting. "I'll think about it," Jake said. Back at home, life was steadily improving. With the service center thriving and Jake contributing more to the household income, the looming threats of eviction and overdue bills became a thing of the past. For the first time, Jake and his mom could breathe a little easier. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table sharing a rare moment of quiet, Sarah looked at Jake with tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you," she said. "You've done more than I ever thought possible." Jake smiled. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their struggles lifting little by little. The State Auto Tech Championships turned out to be one of the most challenging experiences of Jake's life. Competing against students who'd grown up with far more resources than he had was intimidating, but Jake relied on his hard-earned skills and determination. The competition involved diagnosing complex engine problems, rebuilding transmissions, and even troubleshooting cutting-edge hybrid systems. In the end, Jake didn't win first place, but he earned a second-place finish, an achievement that brought him recognition from both his peers and professionals in the industry. "Don't be disappointed," Mr. Bennett told him afterward. "Second place in your first competition is incredible. And this is just the beginning." By the time Jake turned 19, his life had transformed completely. The service center he managed was one of the top-rated in the region, and he was in the process of earning his certification as a master mechanic. Tom Harrison's mentorship had become more like a partnership, and Jake knew he was on the path to something extraordinary. One day, as Jake was locking up the service center, Tom approached him with a smile. "You've done a hell of a job here, Jake," he said, "but I've got one more offer for you." Jake raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "I want to make you a co-owner of the service center," Tom said. "You've earned it." Jake stared at him, stunned. "Co-owner? Are you serious?" "Completely," Tom said. "You've proven yourself time and time again. This place wouldn't be what it is without you." Jake shook his head, a grin spreading across his face. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Tom said, clapping him on the shoulder. Jake nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "Yes. Absolutely, yes." Years later, as Jake looked back on his journey, he marveled at how far he'd come. What had started as a simple act of kindness, helping a stranger fix his car, had led to a career, a legacy, and a life he could be proud of. And as he stood in the bustling service center he now co-owned, watching his team work with the same dedication he'd once shown, Jake knew one thing for certain. The road to greatness is built one small step at a time, and it's worth every mile paying it forward. The years that followed Jake's partnership in the service center were a blur of growth and accomplishment. What began as a struggling garage on the edge of town had become a premier destination for high-quality automotive service. Jake had overseen the hiring of a larger, more diverse team, introduced advanced diagnostics tools, and implemented a training program for aspiring mechanics. Under his leadership, the service center was thriving, and Jake's reputation had grown well beyond their small town. But for Jake, success wasn't just about personal achievement, it was about giving back. One crisp autumn morning, Jake arrived at the service center early, as he always did. The air was cool, the sky painted with the soft hues of sunrise. He parked his truck in the lot, taking a moment to admire the building that had come to symbolize so much more than just a place of work. It was here that he learned what he was capable of, and it was here that he'd started building a future, not just for himself, but for others. Inside, his team was already hard at work. The buzz of power tools and the hum of engines filled the air, a symphony Jake had come to love. As he walked through the garage, he paused to chat with a few of the mechanics, offering advice and encouragement. Among them was Louis, who had become one of Jake's closest allies over the years. "Morning, boss," Louis said, glancing up from under the hood of a car. "You're here earlier than usual." "Couldn't sleep," Jake admitted. "Got a lot on my mind." Louis smirked. "You? Worrying? That's a first." Jake laughed, shaking his head. "Not worrying. Planning." Louis raised an eyebrow. "What kind of planning?" "You'll see," Jake said cryptically, giving Louis a pat on the shoulder before heading to his office. That afternoon, Jake held a meeting in the break room. The entire team gathered, their curiosity evident. Jake stood at the front of the room, a stack of papers in his hands and a determined look on his face. "Thanks for coming, everyone," he began. "I've been thinking a lot lately about how far we've come. This place started as a small operation, and now we're one of the best service centers in the region. That's thanks to all of you." There were murmurs of appreciation, and a few people exchanged smiles. "But I'd also been thinking about the next step," Jake continued. "I want this place to be more than just a business. I want it to be a place where people can get a start, like I did." Jake held up the stack of papers. "These are applications for the Accelerate program. It's something I've been working on for a while. The idea is simple. We partner with local schools to offer internships and training for students interested in automotive work. They'll come here, learn from us, and get real-world experience. And if they show promise, we'll help them get into technical schools, or even hire them." The room was silent for a moment, and then the applause began. Louis was the first to stand, clapping loudly. "Now that's what I'm talking about," he said, grinning. Jake felt a wave of relief and pride as he looked around the room. The support of his team meant everything to him. The Accelerate program launched a few months later, and it quickly became a cornerstone of the service center's identity. High school students from all over the region applied, eager for the chance to work under Jake's mentorship. Some were shy and unsure, much like Jake had been when he first started, but he saw their potential and worked tirelessly to bring it out. One of those students was Ethan, a quiet 17-year-old with a knack for fixing things. Ethan reminded Jake of himself in so many ways: his worn clothes, his uncertain demeanor, and his hunger to prove himself. "Ethan," Jake said one afternoon as they worked together on an engine rebuild, "you ever think about going to technical school?" Ethan looked up, startled. "Me? I don't think I could afford it." Jake smiled. "Neither could I. But someone gave me a chance, and now I want to do the same for you. If you're serious about this, I'll help you get there." Ethan's eyes widened. "You'd do that?" "Absolutely," Jake said. "You've got talent, Ethan. Don't let doubt hold you back." As the years went on, the Accelerate program grew, helping dozens of students find their footing in the automotive world. Some went on to work at the service center, while others pursued careers at major dealerships and repair shops. Jake took pride in every one of their successes, knowing that he was helping to shape a better future. But his commitment to giving back didn't stop there. One day, Jake received a call from Tom Harrison. The older man's voice was as steady and warm as ever, but there was a hint of weariness that Jake couldn't ignore. "Jake," Tom said, "I've been thinking about retiring." Jake felt a pang of sadness. Tom had been more than a mentor. He'd been a guiding force in Jake's life. "You've earned it," Jake said. "But what happens to the dealership?" "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," Tom said. "I want you to take it over." Jake's breath caught. "Me? Tom, I don't know if I... Stop, Tom interrupted, his tone firm. You've already proven you can handle it. You've built the service center into something incredible, and you've got the vision to take the dealership to the next level. I can't think of anyone better for the job. Jake was quiet for a moment, the weight of the offer sinking in. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Tom said, his voice softening, and keep building on what we started. Jake nodded, even though Tom couldn't see him. Okay, I'll do it. Taking over the dealership was a challenge unlike any Jake had faced before, but he rose to the occasion. He expanded the Accelerate program to include internships at the dealership, giving students even more opportunities to learn and grow. He introduced new services, modernized the showroom, and built partnerships with manufacturers that brought in cutting-edge technology. By the time Jake turned 25, he was not only running one of the most successful dealerships in the region, but also changing lives in the process. His story had become a local legend, a testament to the power of hard work, determination, and kindness. One evening, as Jake locked up the dealership, he stood for a moment in the parking lot, looking at the rows of gleaming cars. He thought about how far he'd come, from the boy on a rusted bike, helping a stranger on the side of the road, to the man who now had the power to help others in ways he'd once only dreamed of. The road to greatness, Jake realized, wasn't just about reaching the top. It was about lifting others along the way. And he was just getting started.